Speaker, it's an honour to be able to participate in another budget debate here in the Legislative Assembly, and I appreciate the opportunity to follow the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker. I think it's fair to say he's a good speaker. From his very earliest days in this place, he was effective in the House, I would say. I think that would not be exaggerating the case at all. I think the Honourable Leader of the Opposition is effective in his communications. Mr. Speaker, not always consistent and accurate, perhaps, but effective nonetheless. And I just want to, because this is a debate, I want to highlight a few of the things that I think I heard him say in his speech and maybe offer another perspective to what he had to say. For example, when he was referencing, Mr. Speaker, his concern about the economy, I can assure the honourable member that we're all very concerned about the economy, that these job losses have hit home for our province in the energy sector, mostly in the energy sector, but not exclusively. I'm from Swift Current, which has long been a community dependent on the oil industry, and so I have friends and neighbours who have gone through something that nobody would ever want them to have to go through, Mr. Speaker. And so what they would need from a government, I think, is a government that would do no harm, a government that would perhaps offer a few ideas to the federal government, and we did that, if you remember, with the well completion proposal that we made to the federal government. It wasn't supported by the NDP, by the way. I recollect that prior to the election. You remember that suggestion to the federal government that perhaps we could get some support from Ottawa for the industry here to deal with some abandoned wells, to complete the wells. We knew that would put people back to work. And yes, it would happen that some oil companies then, who couldn't afford to do it at the time, would have that perhaps provided to them, much like, by the way, the country has helped car manufacturers when they've needed it, much like the country has helped aeronautical manufacturing companies when they've needed it, much like the federal government has helped agriculture when they've needed it. We thought, well, now more than ever, the energy sector could use a little bit of help. So we listened to the oil field service workers, and a particular entrepreneur from Weyburn constituency, from the city of Weyburn, and we proposed it to the federal government, whereby some support for them would put people back to work completing wells, an environmental benefit to be sure, and an employment economic development benefit to be sure. So here was an opportunity for the NDP to support a plan like that, not just to talk about their concern for job losses or their concern for the economy, but actually to support a common sense proposal from the government, and they refused to. Now, Mr. Speaker, to be fair, their counterparts in Alberta initially weren't supportive. They never outright rejected the idea, but later on, to their credit, the Alberta government also came on board, and still the provincial NDP opposed that. So, Mr. Speaker, I would say to the member opposite and to the NDP in general, there is a need for consistency. If you're going to say that you're advocating for jobs for the oil sector, for the energy sector, then you have to act like it. And you have to, I think, at least find a way to work with the government in proposing a new idea to the federal government. I've heard my honourable friend say they want to work with us on common sense, good ideas for Saskatchewan. Maybe the well completion idea we proposed wasn't quite right. Maybe we could have worked together to figure out how to improve it, but they weren't interested. They just rejected it out of hand. I would also point this out to my honourable friend. If he's worried about Saskatchewan's economy, then I think he and all of us need to send out clarion messages of consistency and support for those essential sectors of our economy. And those essential sectors, even though we are more diversified than ever before, are still agriculture, and it's energy, and it's the mining sector, it's the resource sector in Saskatchewan. So, and in terms of consistency of message, I think it matters what appointments we make as leaders in this place. And I know the honourable member chose for his finance critic, the one who provided the main critique to the budget of the province, someone who did support the further discussion of at least the entertaining of the LEAP manifesto, and they deny this. And remember, the LEAP manifesto it goes against everything we do in the province. If ever implemented, it would destroy the economy. It doesn't like modern agriculture. It wants to end all pipelines. It doesn't like mining. Imagine that, Mr. Speaker, that item would come to the floor of a convention that any of us might be attending, what our response would be as representatives of the people of this province. I think a reasonable response for any of us in this place, regardless of where we sit, would be to get to the microphone in that hall, in that convention deliberation, and to say this has no business being considered, especially in Western Canada. But here's what the member voted for. The finance critic, handpicked by the Leader of the Opposition, voted for this. Therefore, be it resolved that the NDP recognizes and supports the LEAP manifesto as a high-level statement of principles as a high-level statement of principles that speaks to the aspirations, histories, and the values of the party. Mr. Speaker, that should be opposed by any member in this House. I don't care what membership card's in their wallet or what party they support. If something like that is proposed, you're worried about the economy, they say, Mr. Speaker. He's saying he didn't see enough concern for the economy in the budget, and I'll get into that in a moment, because I don't agree. But what we say outside of this province is important, and our actions are important in terms of those across the country who simply don't like what we do, and they'd like to stop what it is that Saskatchewan does, and does very well in terms of feeding the world and providing the answers around energy security that the fastest growing economies of the world have. Speaker,
never get back to Saskatchewan.
The other decisions the leader of the NDP have made is to assemble a renewal committee, and the chairperson of this renewal committee, this would be a very important apparatus within the party. The chairperson of this renewal committee, I believe, is the former candidate for the NDP, and I believe she didn't just vote in principle to have a discussion about LEAP. I think she signed it. She signed the LEAP manifesto, and I would say, if I was the leader of the opposition or a leader of the party, I would say, sorry, I mean, we want you involved in the party, but in terms of leading our renewal process, that's a deal breaker. Because in this place and in our party, we stand with the interests of the people of the province of Saskatchewan. And no, frankly, we're not interested in countenancing a debate that actually goes contrary to those interests. That would devastate the Saskatchewan economy. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, we see the leader of the opposition in the NDP appoint a chief of staff who was a former staff person with Mr. Mulcair, who would have and did oppose the Keystone Pipeline. Now, there wouldn't have been Saskatchewan oil in that pipeline had it ever been approved by the Obama administration, but it would have done this. It would have narrowed the gap. It would have narrowed the gap between Brent price and West Texas, which has, in certain years of our budgeting, meant hundreds of millions of dollars, and for the industry, it meant billions of dollars. Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important that who we appoint and what we and how we act is as important as how effectively we may communicate in this particular legislative assembly. If I can, Mr. Speaker, very quickly, I'll point out that the leader of the opposition talked a lot in his speech about cuts, and I think some of the characterization perhaps wasn't quite right. But let's just assume that the leader of the opposition was breaking with tradition and dealing exclusively in fact when he was talking about those cuts. Let's consider what was in their campaign document. He just finished running a very successful campaign in Regina Rosemont. We know it was a successful campaign because the Sask Party had an excellent campaign, an excellent candidate in that constituency. the number? What is the quantum of those tax reductions over all of these years? It's $6 billion.
Wow.
That is the amount of money that government has given back to businesses. That is the amount of money that government, it's their money in the first place, that's the amount that this government has given back to small businesses, to farmers, to property owners, and to families. Very significantly to families, Mr. Speaker. And the Leader of the Opposition says that was a waste. He said it again in his budget debate, and member after member over there has said, well, you know, the government has blown whatever number it comes up with in terms of billions with a B, or whatever number they're using. The bottom line is this, Mr. Speaker, I don't think Saskatchewan families think it's a waste to reduce their taxes. Here is what our party has done with some of the proceeds of growth in this province. In 2007, a single person making $25,000 in income paid $1,979 in taxes. In 2016, they paid $1,018 in taxes. That's a savings of 49%. A family of 4 with $50,000 income used to pay $3,382 in provincial taxes under the NDP when we first took office. Now they pay $721.
What do you think of that, Dave?
And that is a decrease of 79%. A family of 4 with $75,000 in income used to pay under the NDP $6,396. Now they pay $4,068, a savings of $2,328 a year, $200 a month, a savings of 36%. And you know, the Leader of the Opposition, and I think this is why they're at danger, at risk potentially of not changing places in this Assembly anytime soon, he thinks that's a waste of money. That's how he describes this. That when you reduce taxes for families to the tune of 36%, 79%, 49%, when you drop 114,000 low-income Saskatchewan people off the tax rolls completely, that's a waste. While we on this side of the House, we don't consider it a waste. We consider it as a part of our growth plan, Mr. Speaker, and we consider the dollars that we appropriate in this Assembly to belong to the people of Saskatchewan and not any party on either side of the House. Mr. Speaker, this budget also makes a number of investments in people, as we've pointed out, as the Minister of Finance has pointed out, and members on this side have done a very good job of canvassing all of those important investments. But one I'd like to focus on, if I can, in my closing minutes here, is the additional investment that we made to the Surgical Wait Times Initiative. Mr. Speaker, when we were able to be fortunate enough to take over government in 2007, here was the sad fact in Saskatchewan. People waited here longer for surgery than anywhere else in Canada. And it seemed in Congress, you know, here in the birthplace of Medicare, the home of Tommy Douglas, we had gotten to a point with healthcare in Saskatchewan that people waited longer for their surgeries here than anywhere else in Canada. And so the Minister of Health, now the Deputy Premier, and carried through it by the current Minister of Health, have developed and implemented a plan whereby we use private clinics, setting aside ideology about private and public, private clinics in the public system, and increased investment, significantly increased investment for surgeries. We've been able to reduce the wait times to the point where we're no longer the longest in the country, but now we're the shortest in all of Canada. Mr. Speaker, in this budget, which is a difficult one, there are challenges. We've chosen, the Minister of Finance is recommending to the House and recommending to your vote and mine that we would increase that we would provide an additional allotment, more money for the Surgical Wait Times Initiative in the province of Saskatchewan. And I hope members on both sides of the House would want to vote in favour of that kind of an initiative. There's a number of other increases in supports, more child care spaces, more support for people with disabilities, 15 drugs added to the formula for cancer treatment. But Mr. Speaker, I do think the work that we're going to do in the Surgical Wait Times Initiative arguably is as important as any of those other key investments for Saskatchewan people. And it's an interesting bridge, I think, to another discussion and debate that we actually had in this Assembly in question period. Because the other thing I think people want in Saskatchewan is they'd like a little bit less ideology and a little bit more common sense. They'd like results from their government, and that's why they didn't much care that it was private clinics that were shortening the wait times. They didn't much care where the clinic was even. They wanted surgery in a timely way. it's the same approach that Saskatchewan people would take to diagnostics, Mr. Speaker. And in this session, and facilitated in part by the health budget certainly, and so very much material to the budget debate, we're going to take the step to provide that private option in CT scans, as we've already done in MRIs. And here again, it's an interesting juxtaposition, it's an interesting contrast, because all these years later, where people of Saskatchewan have moved on, moved way beyond the ideologies of the 50s and the 60s on healthcare, and now are focused on the need for innovation and results, we have one party that is clinging to that tired ideology. We saw it in question period today. Unbelievably, the health critic, I'm sure approved by the Leader of the Opposition, took to her feet in the Assembly today and said, you know, when we were in government, sure, we allowed the Saskatchewan Rough Riders and workers' compensation patients to get their diagnostics, to pay to jump the queue. That's what they were doing.
We shouldn't allow anyone.
They were jumping the queue as long as they paid for a scan on the public system. That was okay, according to the ideology of members opposite. But expanding that opportunity to everyone else is somehow wrong. And expanding it beyond MRIs to CTs is somehow wrong. And in that little debate, I think there's a bit of a microcosm of the dynamic of politics in Saskatchewan today, just these few short weeks after the last election campaign. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to remember that this is a province whose people are kind of, they've always been focused on results. They've been focused on common sense, and they've used different vehicles to achieve those results over the years. But, Mr. Speaker, they'd like results from their government and a little less ideology. For our part, Mr. Speaker, we're going to work hard to provide that common sense, to provide those solutions, to meet the challenges that exist today. And, Mr. Speaker, I think the budget is a good example of that kind of government. We can always do better. We can always work harder. But I'm proud to support the budget because, Mr. Speaker, it speaks to those basic principles. It lays out a long-term vision for a strong Saskatchewan, one that is leading the country. And I'm proud, Mr. Speaker, to indicate to you today, for the first time formally, that I'm going to be opposing the NDP amendment and supporting the budget of the Minister of Finance.
Hear, hear.